Hello everyone, it's Monday and you're watching Within the Frame. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. Last Thursday, President Yoon met United States Trade Representative Katherine. Mainly discussed were concerns over the Inflation Reduction Act and the Chips and Science Act. Starting March 31st, companies that want to build semiconductor factories in the U.S. must submit an application for subsidies to the U.S. Department of Commerce. This includes guardrail provisions, however, and requires confidential business information to be disclosed. So how do local chipmakers see their next moves? Meanwhile, specific guidelines of the Inflation Reduction Act have been unveiled. Seoul welcomed this, saying it has relieved domestic companies' concerns, but experts say some issues remain. What are they? For an in-depth analysis, we welcome Yang Jun-sok, professor at the Catholic University of Korea. Professor Yang, welcome.
Happy to be here.
And we also have Yang Jun-sok, professor at Ewha Women's University, on the line as well. Professor, welcome to the show.
Hello, thanks for inviting me.
All right, first question to our Professor Yang Jun-sok. The United States Trade Representative Katherine met President Yoon in Seoul last Thursday. Now, what questions or requests in particular did President Yoon have for the representative?
Well, not only President Yoon, but throughout the visit, many Korean officials did visit USTR Thai, but from reports, what they discussed was basically the same no matter what the official was, who the official was. First, concerning the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act, while the new guidelines have provided much clarity, the guidelines have actively reflected many of the concerns that Korean companies had, but there are still concerns about some U.S. requirements on Korean companies. Most notably, the requirement to submit various technical and managerial proprietary information to the U.S. government, and the requirement that if companies receiving subsidies have unexpected profit or unexpectedly high cash flow, they must pay back some of the subsidies that they received from the U.S. government. Also, while many of the guidelines did reflect concerns of Korean companies, they are not completely set yet, and there seems to be some U.S. politicians who are opposed to giving subsidies to semiconductor companies, whether or not they be Korean, American, or otherwise. They talked about how the current guidelines should be maintained as much as possible. And because CHIPS Act and IRA are inherently domestic protectionist, I think they also talked about how the U.S. should not go further or try not to go further in putting protectionist measures into their trade policies.
Right. So mainly discussed were U.S. CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, Professor Yang Jun-sok, let's first dig down into the specific of the U.S. Chips and Science Act. Specific guidelines of the guardrail provision have already been unveiled, and they say the act will limit expansion of semiconductor manufacturing capacity in foreign countries of concern, mainly China, to 5% for 10 years. Could you tell us more about the proposed rules related to guardrail provisions and how chip makers, namely Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix, are seeing this?
Well, first of all, let me brief you about this act, the Chips and Science Act. So August last year, the U.S. Congress has enacted to reserve $280 billion to support science and chips industry. And among this, $52 billion is reserved for semiconductors. And in this, $39 billion is related to the subsidies of the manufacturing facilities. So March 21st, U.S. government has declared details and so-called the guidelines for the details of this Chips and Science Act. Well, in short, the guidelines are pretty somehow scary for lots of the global chip manufacturers, because if they violate these requirements, all of the financial subsidies will be returned to the U.S. government. So what are the requirements from the U.S. government? As for the advanced facility, the chip manufacturers can expand over 5% in the foreign countries of concern, such as China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. And semiconductors are very critical to national security, applies this regulation. As for the different category of semiconductors, I mean legacy semiconductors, the beneficiaries can increase their production capacity up to 10% in those foreign countries of the concerns. But if the beneficiaries can sell over 85% of their produced chips in those countries, then they can expand the manufacturing capacity over 10%. But we should keep in mind that these requirements are related to manufacturing capacity, not the technical investment to upgrade the technical, the features such as increase the integration. So yes, and lots of global firms are really have expressed some lukewarm responses to this regulation. For example, since March 31st, lots of chip manufacturers are supposed to submit their applications, but no company has submitted the application yet.
Right, so they're all trying to wait and see how it goes. Now, Professor Yang Jun-sok, new guidelines also request the detailed projections for revenue and profit be entered into an Excel-like tool, as well as providing information on items such as so-called yield rates. Now, industry watchers say these demands are too sensitive. What is this all about, and what is your takeaway on this?
Okay, well, they are requiring some financial information as well as technological information. Some of the managerial information that U.S. is requiring include cash flows and expected profits. The justification on the U.S. is that the part of the criteria for selecting firms which get the subsidies are commercial strategy and viability of the subsidy recipients. And the U.S. is requiring that the firms may have to return some of the subsidies if their cash flows are higher than expected. The U.S. Department of Commerce has said that this is sort of a safety feature to make sure that the companies report accurate figures. But my own feeling is that there has been a lot of criticism by politicians, not only by opposition party in the United States, but also President Biden's own party, that they should not give subsidies to large semiconductor companies because they are already rich enough. So this seems, and there has been criticism about giving subsidies to large companies, giving subsidies to the rich since the 2008 global financial crisis, when the U.S. gave subsidies to banks, and a lot of banks used that money to finance bonuses for their executives. So this seems to be a measure which shows to politicians to oppose the subsidy measure that if the subsidies reward these companies too much, the U.S. will get something out of it as well. Now, for technical information, they are including some technical information like yield rates. What the yield rates are is, well, you produce semiconductors in wafers. Those are those circular things that the President Biden was holding in the video a few minutes ago. And semiconductors are produced on top of those wafers. And some of those wafers will be bad. Most of them will be good. That's the yield rate. Now, if the yield rate goes up, that means that there are less bad semiconductors in the same batch. So that means the technology has improved. And the Korean firms may actually want to submit that information to the U.S. government because, as Professor Yang Jun-sok just mentioned, if the technological factors goes up and capacity goes up because of the technological improvements, that will not count toward the capacity restraints that the U.S. is imposing on companies in China and elsewhere.
Right, I see. Because of these so many strings attached, I can see why Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix might be very concerned about this act. But Professor Yang Jun-sok, what other global chip makers such as TSMC are also viewing these regulations being too demanding as well? Last Thursday, TSMC Chairman Mark Liu said that certain supplementary restrictions within the act are unacceptable and could dissuade potential partners from applying for the CHIPS Act grant. How do you see this?
Well, actually, I do agree with the concerns of the TSMC and also many other global chip makers, because the U.S. government is demanding too much about all the internal operations of the global chip makers. For example, the U.S. government asking for like a financial statement and cost structures and yield rates and manufacturing process, even the customer list. I mean, these are actually business confidential. The business confidentials can be sued if you expose them without, the consent. The Samsung Electronics already invests over $50 billion in China. And one factory in Xi'an is taking care of about over 40% overall NAND flash of Samsung Electronics. Almost same story to SK Hynix. I mean, they have factory in Wuxi, and Wuxi factory produces over 48% of overall DRAM, the chips. Well, the TSMC has declared to invest over $40 billion in Arizona, and Samsung Electronics also declared to invest over $200 billion in the United States. And U.S. government is wanting more, demanding more. So that's why no company has submitted the application to benefit this financial support, because all the chip makers are very busy to calculate the pros and cons if they earn the financial support from these chips and the Science Act. So that's what happens in the future.
Right, I see. Now, until now, we have talked about the concerns that are related to U.S. Chips and Science Act, but why don't we also tap on the Inflation Reduction Act? Now, Professor Yang Jun-sok, the U.S. Treasury Department announced new guidelines on tax credits for electric vehicles under this Inflation Reduction Act. Could you tell us what these proposed guidelines are?
Okay, well, the current law states that for buyers whose income is below $150,000 for individuals, there are slightly higher thresholds for joint filers and head of households. But for people below those threshold income, a tax credit of $7,500 will be given for electric vehicles whose suggested retail price is below $80,000 for vans, SUVs, and trucks, and $55,000 for other types of electric vehicles. To qualify beyond the limits on the suggested retail price, the final assembly of these electric vehicles must take place in North America, and 50% of the value of battery components must be manufactured in North America for 2023, and this percentage will go up steadily over the next few years to reach 100% in 2029. Further, 40% of the value of critical minerals for the vehicle batteries must be from the United States or from countries that U.S. has a free trade agreement with. And also, this percentage will continue to rise steadily, reaching 80% by 2029. Recent guidelines have stated that for now, U.S. will accept Chinese-made anodes and cathodes, crucial components in EV batteries. So for now, the Korean EV battery makers are saying that, well, the worst expectations have not come true. The guidelines as is are currently workable. Further, the subsidies are $7,500. That is a very large subsidy for buyers, but because of domestic inflation in the United States, as well as the fact that electric vehicles made in North America will probably be more expensive than electric vehicles made elsewhere, the actual advantage from the $7,500 subsidy may not be as large as we currently think.
Right, I see. Now, Professor Yang, as our Professor Yang Jun-sok said, Seoul's industry ministry welcomed this proposed guideline that substantially relieves the uncertainty of the domestic battery and material industries. Yet, some media outlets are saying that foreign entities of concern have yet to be unveiled, and that since China is likely to be one of them, South Korean EV makers would have to eventually lower their dependence on critical minerals from China. What is this about?
Well, the IRA is well explained by the Professor Yang, but the American government announced the details of this IRA the March 31st, and there are some good news from this announcement. The first one is, well, as Professor Yang already mentioned, all the electric vehicles should be manufactured and assembled in the United States, but the exception is lease vehicles. And Hyundai Motors produces a lot of the vehicles for the lease. And lease vehicles are accepted from this regulation, so there is no impact on Hyundai Motors as long as they produce vehicles for lease. And the second issue is about the mineral, critical minerals. Let's say lots of the Korean firms import their minerals from Indonesia and Argentina, which are not necessarily the FTA agreement with the United States. So we import all those minerals and produce the cathode or anode active materials and export them to the United States and produce cathode plate and anode plate in the United States. I mean, this is quite a complicated process. And according to the exception of this regulation, Korean companies can benefit from this regulation. In other words, we don't need to make any changes in our supply chains or in the process, because as long as we can add more than 50% of value adds on the critical minerals they import for Argentina, Indonesia, even though they do not make an agreement, the free trade agreement with the United States. And third one, the key issue is, even though they had prepared more the timeline for the critical minerals and the battery components in the future, but we cannot use the battery components or critical minerals from the foreign entities of concern since 2024 next year and 2025 for the critical minerals. And the United States government has not declared what are the foreign entities of concerns, but many people estimate that these are all the companies located in China. So we should be really careful not to import or to purchase any battery components from next year or any critical minerals from in 2 years from those foreign entities of concern. So these are three major issues you need to pay attention to, as well as all the details, as Professor Yang mentioned about the IRA.
Right, I see. Now, Professor Yang Jun-sok, another lingering concern is that the guideline still calls for components in EV batteries to be assembled, eventually be assembled in North American continent. How would this affect local EV makers, especially, Hyundai Motor Group?
Okay, well, because this is set in law, it's not set in regulation, it is set in the law itself, it is very unlikely that the U.S. Biden administration has any leeway on changing the actual percentages. So that means that a lot of what would be produced in Korea may be moved to the United States. On the other hand, I think there is a chance that the United States may back off in the future, partially because, it is more expensive to produce these parts in the United States. And if the U.S. inflation remains high, then they may decide that they can use less production in North America and perhaps more production from friendly countries. So I am kind of hoping for that. But at least in the short term, Korea will be able to export some parts, so it will not be a very large problem with Hyundai and Kia, but they will probably lose some business in the long run to their American subsidiaries or companies.
Right, I see. Now, Professor Yang Dong, another notable issue is how Washington struck a deal with Japan to grant Tokyo the same treatment as an FTA partner regarding vital minerals for EV batteries. Now, negotiations apparently with the EU are also going on. How would this affect South Korean EV makers?
Well, absolutely, it makes some bad impact on the EV manufacturers, because as Professor Yang mentioned, there are actually three conditions for the consumers to benefit 7,500 tax credit from electric vehicles. Well, one of them is about the critical minerals. So if the EV manufacturers can extract or process the critical minerals from the United States or any countries which the United States has the free trade agreement, then the consumers can benefit about $3,750 of tax credit. But Japan doesn't have FTA agreement with the United States. Now, the Japan is regarded as the extraordinary companies, right, who can benefit from this $3,750 of tax credit for the consumers if they produce their batteries, right, from those critical minerals. So absolutely, electric vehicles, this market is very sensitive to prices. Now, Korean manufacturers, they have to build their factories in the United States, whereas Japan can produce the batteries with the critical minerals, they import and produce even in the inland. So absolutely, Korean manufacturer will, suffer a lot somehow from this, the cost pressures due to this the extraordinary, benefits to Japan.
Right. Now, though the time is running out, I would like to ask our Professor Yang Jun-sok about this. Now, President Yoon is scheduled to have a summit with U.S. President Joe Biden in April. Now, will this summit result in any meaningful improvements in the Inflation Reduction Act or CHIPS Act? And what are among the most pressing things that Seoul should be asking for? Could you briefly tell us?
Okay, well, as I said, there are some items in the CHIPS Act and the IRA which is set by law. So President Biden will not be able to change any of that. The percentages that we've mentioned about the assembly in the United States, the critical components for the batteries, those cannot be changed without except changes in law from Congress, so that will probably not be touched. But there will be a lot of details that perhaps can be used to mitigate some of the effects, and I'm sure that President Yoon will talk about it with President Biden, or the staffs will. But I think a further wider issue is whether the United States will continue to go protectionist policies and tighten their restrictions on the WTO and global spread of free trade, and that might be something that they will start talking about. They will obviously not get any answers here, but still, it will serve as a stage to talk about how the United States trade policy will develop in the next few years.
Right, I really hope the talks go well. Now, unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition, but thank you, Professor Yang Jun-sok and Professor Yang Hee-dong, for your insights. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Now, this is all for Within the Frame tonight. We'll be back tomorrow with more in-depth stories. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.